window open. It is the 1st of April. Unfortunately, none of this is a joke. It is going ahead. I'd love to prank you all and tell you it isn't, but yeah, I didn't know if that was gonna. Well, I didn't know if I could deliver that very well, so I'm not. So yeah, anyway, thanks all for joining us, and without further ado, we'll crack on. Assume everyone can see the screen, okay? Right. So just a bit of housekeeping to start with. Anna, I don't know if you want to run through this.
Yeah, morning everyone. Hope everyone's doing well. So for this webinar, firstly, it is going to be recorded and this will be sent out to all attendees post-event, as well as the webinar slides. We're going to have all cameras and microphones turned off for the duration of the webinar, and we're also going to hold all questions to the end. But if you'd like to use the Q&A tab at the top, we'll come back to these at the end of the webinar, and you can also vote on these if there's a question that you're particularly interested in. Otherwise, we'll have some polls that pop up throughout the webinar. If you're able to respond to those, make sure you have your say. But otherwise, I'll hand over to Charlie and we can get started.
Thanks, Anna. So yeah, just a bit of an agenda of what we're going to look at today. Just a bit of an intro to who Eclipse are, in case people don't know. Where are we now with reform and who's affected, and what sort of evidence you're going to need to start gathering to maintain your place in the queue. How is that then going to be applied to the existing queue, and what protections are available from this process, and what you as customers should be doing next. Just to clarify, today we will be focusing purely on CMP 435, so that is the application of these reforms to the existing queue rather than the enduring process going forwards, given that's probably what's most pertinent at the moment. We will follow up if there's a need to for the enduring process, but it looks like at least new applications probably won't be accepted till around November time anyway, so we've got a bit more time on that. We also won't be touching on project designation. Again, if that's something that you think is relevant for one of your projects, do get in touch and we can help you work through it. So who are we? Eclipse Power is a group of networks-focused businesses. I'm sure most people will know us mainly as the IDNO, Eclipse Power Networks. It's been around since 2017 with a large focus on large power connections, particularly battery generation and transmission connections, as well as your more traditional IDNO loads, EV charging, residential, things like that. That business was going from strength to strength, and we realized that there was probably a bit of a need in the market for support with grid connections, particularly with how challenging it now is and how much things are changing. So October 23, we set up Eclipse Power Solutions, which is the business that I head up. So we're here to help you earlier on in the development cycle, finding your grid capacity, making your applications, reviewing them, being your agent for the DNO basically, right through to assisting with feasibility design, cable route due diligence, and things like that. And we're not tied to the IDNO, so we'll happily look at projects that maybe aren't suitable for IDNO adoption as well. And then finally, in the last, I want to say 6 weeks, we set up Eclipse Power Optimize. So this is looking at owning and operating private networks, be that large-scale transmission networks to co-locate demand and generation behind the meter, and hopefully reduce those network charges you'll be paying, down to the other end of the scale, residential microgrids, sub 1 megawatt, rooftop solar, battery, zero bill sort of initiative. This is quite an exciting new business. It's early days, but we believe it offers a different solution to get connected and makes use of localized green energy, which some of which may be looking for a route to market after these reforms. And as you also know, we were looking at getting a transmission license that currently has been paused due to Ofgem not having capacity to look at. So maybe something that we revisit in the future. So yeah, Eclipse Power Solutions, as mentioned, we are here to help you with your grid connections. Be it scrutinizing the offers you get back, challenging the DNO for a more or National Grid or the TO for a more cost-effective solution, helping decipher and understand what those offers mean for you commercially and technically, being your agent with the DNO, being your trusted partner every step of the way, basically to help your grid connections process move a bit smoother. As I say, that can come with the IDNO or without. And yeah, we're all working here to make it easier for you to connect to the grid quickly and effectively. So just a short intro to the team, and then we will get into the content. So I'm Charles. I head up Eclipse Power Solutions. Have been at Eclipse for 2.5 years. Prior to that, I was working for a number of solar and storage developers in grid connections manager roles. So the other side of the fence, if you like. So I understand kind of the developer journey and the pain points that you may be facing. I'll move over to Matt.
Hi, morning everyone. Matt Prodescu. I work as a grid consultant in Charlie's team. I've been with Eclipse Power Solutions for coming up to a year and a half now, and quite similar to Charlie, previous experience in the development world with a main focus on transmission connections.
Thank you, Matt. And Amna?
Hi all, good morning. Thank you for joining. I'm Amna. I'm a grid engineer with Eclipse Power Solutions. Been here for just over a year now, I think. My previous experience is mainly in design engineering for the ICPs. So yeah, this is a little bit different, and yeah, hopefully this is helpful for you all.
Thanks, guys. Cool. So yeah, our details are there should you need to reach out to us with any queries or concerns after this event. So probably not going to win too many prizes for the prettiest slides, but yeah, hopefully the information is what's important. So I thought I would just sort of explain where we are now with reforms. People talk about connections reform as if it's a single sort of item. It really isn't. It's a suite of changes and reforms that are going on to the industry. So on the far left, we've got the initial code changes to the CUSC, which is the code which governs how we connect to and use the transmission system. That's CMP 434 for the new process, CMP 435 for the existing queue, and a sort of housekeeping modification to the transmission code, which is CM 095. Alternative working group alternative change modification, I believe is what WACM stands for, were raised at both work groups to implement a pause for market self-regulation. We'll talk a little bit about that later. Ofgem is minded to approve those with both WACMs. NESO is lobbying to not approve the WACMs as they believe it will slow things down without adding much benefit. But I think that's for you to decide whether that's the case or not. Sitting outside of these codes are essentially the beef of the meat of the reform, and they're the methodologies which NESO will use to essentially rejig the queue. So that's a connections network design methodology, project designation methodology, which we won't touch on today, but that's intended to protect queue positions for other innovative new technologies that aren't in scope of this at the moment, or needed projects that will have a long lead time and cannot deliver by 2035, such as new nuclear power stations, and also the methodology to be Gate 2 ready, which we will also touch on today. Those methodologies are not codified, but there are measures in place in the license changes which which govern how those methodologies can be changed, and what governance is in place, which is obviously quite important for investor certainty. To complement these, we've had to make changes to all of the different licenses that are afforded to the networks, and then there's been consultations on all of these things, plus another consultation that Ofgem have done, a non-statutory consultation on their minded to decision, as well as the statutory consultation on licenses. So at the moment, Ofgem have said that they would like to approve all of it as it stands. We don't yet know the outcome of that consultation that was ongoing, so we will wait and see. But the received wisdom is that we should have a decision by the middle of this month, which I think will be welcome to everyone, myself included, who's been involved in this process for probably getting on for 3 years now. And other people in Eclipse as well have been sitting in the various work groups. In the background, Eclipse has also been involved with other network colleagues in the various implementation hubs. So that is the DNOs, the TOs, the IDNOs, getting together and working out how on earth we're actually going to implement this in practice. So what methodologies and procedures need to be in place in each individual business, and that's been progressing in the background. Post-decision, we expect the distribution window for evidence submission, which we'll talk about in a minute, to go open quite quickly. I think DNOs are encouraging their customers to submit information as soon as they have it. There is a legal requirement after a license change has been approved for a pause, if you like, which can invite challenge if there is any, whereby nothing can be changed. So that's 56 days plus 4 weeks, and only after that period can we start to open up the transmission window. And as I'm sure you will all know, most DNO projects have a transmission impact on them, so that will be where the DNOs are then required to submit to NESO as well. The window will then be closed. There'll then be this self-regulation pause, which we'll talk about later, and then the final data will be taken and the queue formation will be done, and then the offers will be issued. The ambition is to issue all offers by the end of this year. I think there's still discussions on whether that's achievable in practice, but that has been the ambition that Ofgem has set out. As we know, many distribution offers are dependent on transmission works, so the DNOs will need to wait for their offers from NESO first before they can then make the offers to you. So there's a good chance that the DNO offers could be pushed out into early spring as a worst case. However, we do expect to see offers being issued in batches based on priority, so that should hopefully speed things up. But as mentioned, this is all still up for discussion. And in complementing these changes, we've got two other code mods at the moment, which is CMP 446, which is looking likely to be approved early May. That will raise the transmission impact assessment threshold, or statement of works threshold, as it's often called, to 5 megawatts in England and Wales, meaning that any projects below 5 megawatts will not need to go through transmission impact assessment and thus will not need to go through this process in totality. So that's really good news for smaller projects. The limit will remain around 200 kilowatts in Scotland, unfortunately. And CMP 448 is currently under consultation, I think until the 7th of April. And that talks about introducing additional financial commitments remaining in the queue. I'm not across the full detail of it at the moment, but the basic premise is that there will be a trigger period where for a certain number of the queue will be sitting in the queue without planning consent, the NESO can trigger this new payment to be brought in to get the queue moving. So anyway, didn't want to spend as long on that slide, but I have. So moving swiftly on, who's affected? Connections reform and the gated design process is relevant for transmission connected generation, transmission connected demand, so all transmission connected projects, as well as relevant embedded generation. So that's anything over the transmission impact assessment threshold connected to DNO or IDNO networks for generation. So that's over 5 megawatts in England and Wales, presently 1, but we hope to see it raised to 5, and over 200 kilowatts in Scotland, but it does vary per grid supply point. Then Clean Power 2030 is brought in, which talks about strategic alignment, which is essentially quotas per region, per DNO and transmission owner region, to meet the Clean Power 2030 goals, and that's known as strategic alignment. So generation will also have to go through that additional step. Embedded demand can continue as normal, so that's demand connected to a DNO network or an IDNO network, or even a transmission connected IDNO network. So if you are looking to access a transmission system for a demand connection, we can still apply on your behalf for a new GSP as a result of embedded demand. That is not in scope of the reforms, but should just caveat that your contracts could still change because the contracted background is going to change. So you might see changes in the works that are required for your projects. Projects that are not Gate 2 ready will not progress. They will not remain in the queue, and they'll get a Gate 1 offer. A Gate 1 offer essentially is indicative. It's a holding offer. It just gives you an indicative point of connection, a worst case connection date, but it does not confer any rights to hold capacity or a queue position to you. So to be honest, it's as good as not having a grid offer, but this was brought in just to kind of manage this process. And yeah, just a caveat, not all technologies are included in strategic alignment. Things like energy from waste are considered waste disposal rather than generation, so they're excluded. So what does it mean to be Gate 2 ready? I just want to start with saying you do not need planning to be Gate 2 ready. There's a bit of a common misconception that you do, but it's not required. You just need to have your land secured. You need to provide a red line boundary that meets the minimum acreage that is required to develop your project. And you need to declare that you are ready and that you've done all of these things. And then you've got to sort of keep that ongoing. So you've got to keep your land signed up for the connection. You've got to submit planning by your planning milestones, and you've got to make sure that your development remains inside the red line boundary. At transmission, there is a portion that can be built outside. DNOs have their own rules in terms of the ENA allowable change guidance. Just to move into a bit more detail on this, the Minimum acreage is based on this land density table that you can see here. This was brought in under the Code Modification Proposal 47, which brought in letters of authority of transmission. This 100% of the land you need for the project must meet this minimum requirement, and you must meet this minimum requirement for each technology that you're proposing to put into Gate 2. Now, there are procedures where you can justify to NESO that you can build this on a smaller land parcel if you're not getting this much land. That will obviously require technical justification and a discussion with NESO. So if you think you cannot meet this land requirement, but you can build your project on a smaller portion of land, don't leave it to the last minute to have those discussions with the DNO or with NESO. NESO have also committed to reviewing this table annually because obviously, as sure as anyone who knows who works in the solar industry, for example, panels get more and more power dense as the years go on, so the space required reduces. A red line boundary. So this does need to be quite detailed. Each DNO and will sort of say what they will require, but this is given out of the NESO guidance, who ultimately are the final arbiter of a lot of this. You need to show all the land you're using for your generation. You need to show your addresses, the coordinates of the north, south, east, west extreme points of the site, scale, orientation, any symbols, how many megawatts you're installing, and the acreage. And if you do have a GeoJSON file, which I think is a sort of file using GIS systems, do also provide that. You don't need to show any land that you're not using for energy generation, such as set aside for skylarks or whatever, or any cable routes. It's important to note that while you now have to apply with an LOA and a red line boundary transmission, it doesn't actually tie you to it. So you can move your land if you wish at Gate 2 by this process. That does not apply at DNO level, however, because the guidance there is quite firm that you have to keep the point of supply inside the red line boundary. So just worth being aware. It's also worth just being aware that if you do radically change your red line boundary at transmission, you could coincidentally change the electrical properties. You could reduce the impedance of the connection or whatever, which could give the TO a right to restudy. So while there is some flexibility there, it's not a carte blanche to kind of do whatever you want. Land rights, this is probably the most important thing. This is what NESO have deemed means you are ready to develop your project. So the most common process, I would imagine, is an option to lease. This must be at least 3 years long from the date that Ofgem decide that they're going to do this. So, if you sign your lease at the end of this month, it will probably need to be 3 years minimum. Any leases signed, options signed prior to implementation don't have a minimum length on it, because it was deemed unfair to ask people to open up agreements that they've already agreed. You must keep the land under option till your connection date, which is pretty self-explanatory, hopefully. And you must be able to lease the land for at least 20 years. Again, if you can justify that your plant has a lower operational life than that, this will be considered, but you will need to probably get across that early with NESO. And it goes without saying the landlord shouldn't be able to unilaterally terminate the option either, or the land isn't secured. If you own the land, no problem, just prove you do. If you've already got a lease, again, the 20-year sort of remaining term applies. And finally, if you are planning to use compulsory purchase powers conferred to you under a development consent order, so this is for large projects, over 50 megawatts in England and Wales, I think that limit is actually being increased to 100 at some point under the planning policy changes, but not 100% sure. But basically, if you've submitted a DCO and you've got a planning reference number, that can be utilised as evidence of having gained land rights. There are other routes as well if land's in probate or you get CPO powers via the means, but they're fairly complicated and edge cases. So if you need any more advice on that, just get in touch. So yeah, just a summary. What do you need to submit and gather to be Gate 2 ready? Check your land rights, make sure they meet the minimum acreage, red line boundary, where is the site, a director letter of readiness declaration. There was a template of that in the methodologies, but it has since been removed as of last week, and I believe NESO will be issuing templates on this soon, but essentially it's signed by the director of the company to say all of this is true and I'm ready to go. And then, yeah, the DNO will check if you're strategically aligned, or NISO will, or if you're eligible for any protections, and provide the evidence for that as well. We'll talk about protections a little bit later on in the slides. So where does this info go? If you're small or medium, so a generator that is below 100 megawatts in England and Wales, below 30 megawatts in South Scotland in Spen's area, or below 10 megawatts in North Scotland in SSE's area, you will submit the evidence directly to the DNO or the transmission connected IDNO, such as Eclipse. We hold contracts for grid supply points around the country to facilitate embedded generation. If those generators are below the small and medium limit, we will be the ones submitting the info on the customer's behalf. Any large projects, that's anything over 100 megawatts in England and Wales, anything over 30 megawatts in South Scotland or 10 megawatts in North Scotland, anything that holds a beggar because they have to, not just because they've chosen to, because they want to participate in a BM, or anything directly connected to transmission, NISO will write to you directly and you'll submit the evidence directly to NISO, to your account managers there, I would imagine. So then, yeah, the verification is completed by both NISO and the DNO. There'll be some initial checks that are done, just to sort of for the initial queue formation, and the more detailed checks will come later during the sort of the detailed design process. Most DNOs now have sort of issued RFIs or been calling their customers or asking people for up-to-date contact information. Make sure that the DNO has the right person on their books, because if you bought a project, it's quite often people don't tell the DNO, and the DNO doesn't have the new customers' details on their system, for example. So I'd really strongly advise making sure your contact details are up to date, because you don't want to miss a link to the portal. A lot of DNOs are doing evidence submission on portals, for example, and you miss out on this process. So once they get all this information, what do they do with it? So the window will close. They will each DNO region is now, sorry, each DNO company is now a distribution zone. It used to be a license area, but now it's each company, which makes no electrical sense, but it's what the government have elected to do. And the transmission network is split up into, off the top of my head, 11 zones. Mm-hmm. In each of those areas, the DNOs or the TO will take their queue and they'll put them all into different technologies. So they'll get all the solar projects, put them in one pot, all the BESS projects, put them in another pot, all the wind projects, put them in another pot. They will then apply the queue formation process to each technology pot within each region, which I'll talk about in a sec. Once the initial queue formation has been done and all the projects that are not Gate 2 ready are taken out, WACOM 1 says that there'll be a publication of an existing agreements register that will list the point of connection, the current connection date, the capacity, and the technology type of each of the projects that is Gate 2 ready. There will then be a pause for 10 working days to allow the market to look at that data against the CP30 targets that have been published, and make an assessment as to whether it's worth either requesting an advancement on their project or whether it's worth backing the project, whether it's worth pulling out. Now, this was proposed at the work group because the work group felt it didn't have any visibility of the methodologies because they were being developed in isolation, and they felt that this would help the market at least get a feel for what the situation looks like, because they're not permitted to publish the whole queue, because there's a section of the Electricity Act which makes it illegal, basically. So the idea was that this would give developers a bit more transparency. Now, Clean Power 30's moved on quite a lot since then, and NISO sort of are saying, well, it doesn't have much utility, it doesn't have all the information the clients are going to need, so what's the point in doing this? Now, the pushback is, well, this was developed at the time when that was the information we had, and industry has voted for it in work group and also in the consultation. So to me, it would seem wrong to not do the pause. But anyway, we're going to go ahead with doing the pause. Other DNOs now, UKPN, for example, following a bit of our engagement with them, actually has now published a dashboard that shows their entire queue based on so aggregate based on protected projects, planning, no planning, etc., versus the quotas, and then each GSP technology types and each sort of status of each project as well. So this sort of information is really starting to help people make better decisions, I think. So anyway, after that 10 working days, during that 10 working days, customers will have an opportunity to withdraw, amend their advancement request, or make an advancement request. Once that's all done, there'll then be a final queue formation. So just to quickly run over the bingo card again. So as I said, they'll form a sub queue for each technology in each zone, based on just the gate 2 projects. The queue position, because the DNO queue position is based on the DNO offer acceptance date. The transmission queue position is based on the NISO counter signature date. So when you sign your connection offer, you send it back to your account manager. They then come back with a countersigned copy. That take some time. So they put provision in to say if it takes NISO longer than 28 days to countersign, the customer's signature date will be taken. So we've got a bit of a weird situation whereby if NISO takes 29 days to sign your offer, you're probably in a better position than if they take 27, but that's what's been put in the methodology. So yeah, there'll be the sort of the sub queue done at DNO level, or at transmission level. Any projects that are eligible for protections, we put at the front, and basically that also includes anything that's already got planning. And then the projects will be ordered in terms of where they've submitted planning, where they haven't submitted planning. They will then be, sorry, I should have said before that, they'll be split into the 2 phases, so 25 to 30 current connection dates and 2031 to 2035 current connection dates. Anyone that's, say, 2032 and requested an advancement to 2038, they will be put in the phase 1 for that initial sort. The projects will be put in their planning order, and then a line will be drawn when the quota for that technology in each phase is reached. Anything that exceeds phase 1 will be put into phase 2. Anything that exceeds phase 2 will not receive a gate 2 offer and will effectively be cancelled, and would have to reapply in the next window if they wish, or wait until the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan is published, which will look at quotas post 2035. Phase 1 will then be reordered back into their relative queue positions. So if you're in phase 1, you will not actually get a worse queue position. You will get your same queue position, or it will improve because of attrition ahead of you. Phase 2 will be kept in the planning order. I think the reason given for this is that they still wanted some market influence in it, and also projects in phase 1 are generally more progressed, so it would have been unfair to rejig them all. Keeping phase 2 in planning order also prioritizes projects that are, more ready to deliver. And then these will be recombined by NISO at the transmission level to look at it in terms of the transmission work. So this is when there's probably a bit of a bone of contention in the industry, and there has been for some time, that the project progression counter signature date will be given as the sort of transmission queue position date for the DNO project. As we know, it has in some cases taken years to get to that point after accepting a DNO offer, but I think it was decided that it would have been far too large an undertaking to rectify that historic wrong. So unfortunately, we're going to have to keep going with it. But then going forwards under the new process, that shouldn't occur anymore because everything will be done in the windows. Important to note that hybrid projects will be treated per technology. So if you've got solar and storage, the solar will be looked at on its own, the storage will be looked at on its own. That means you could end up with technologies in different gates, technologies in different pots. The lower of either the install capacity of the technology or the total export capacity will be taken as what the capacity of that technology is. And another thing to note, particularly for Eclipse customers, is if you are connected via a transmission connected IDNO, you will now be counted in the distribution zone, not the transmission zone, which is a change, which I guess is positive or negative depending where you are in the country. So yeah, it looks fairly complicated, but these diagrams are quite useful. If you have any concerns, don't hesitate to get in touch. Finally, advancement requests. So the whole purpose of connections reform, if you like, was to speed up things. So they're bringing in a process whereby you can request an advanced connection date. So at the window in May, when it opens, when you give your evidence, you can also say, well, actually, my current connection date is 2034, but I can deliver my project in 2029. I would like to request a 2029 connection date, please. And they go, okay, cool, yeah. And there might be a fee payable. There's talk of it being a full MODAP fee, which I think would be disproportionate because it's quite expensive, but there will be a fee. And also you can request it during or after during the 10-day pause that we've already discussed. You can also adjust it during the pause. The DNOs and TOs will then sort of do a sense check just to see, will do a sense check just to see if it's feasible. If they feel it is, they will restudy the connection based on the the new connection date, and that will be given as sort of the maximum. So if you request 2028, they'll look to give you 2028. If they could give you 2027, they won't, because you've asked for 2028 at transmission level. DNOs have said, I think, that they will look to backfill their queues using the technical limits, but at transmission level, it will be just based on what the maximum request is. If you like, you can ask them to consider a new POC. So say you've got a connection at North Kent Node C, as I'm sure many people on this call do, those sort of fake substations. You might say, actually, I want to change a point of connection, and you'll be looked at the original GSP, perhaps, that you were going to connect at. And also you could look at maybe a flexible connection, restricted connection, but if we looked at on a case-by-case basis. Otherwise, the projects will be assessed on the same terms as the existing contract, just with the new date. So say if you've got an intertrip or some other outage condition, that will be on an enduring basis. It will be assessed as if that still existed. If there's any temporary restrictions, say you've got an intertrip for 2 years and it will fall away, they might change. But if you've got an intertrip that you've accepted forever, they will consider that still to be in place if it's appropriate. The gate 2 offer will then be issued up to the best advancement date. Now, it's worth putting a lot of thought into what dates you request, because once the offer is issued, you then obviously have the 3 months acceptance period, or however long it's going to be. During that period, you can ask for the offer to be reissued back to the original date if you want to, but not if you change pot. So not if you've gone from after 2030 to before 2030. This is to stop people speculatively requesting advancements and then falling back in. The risk if you ask for a reoffer back to your original date is that your works could increase or could change, because that contracted position you did have no longer exists and the background has changed. So do put some thought into when you request. And if you don't accept the gate 2 offer, the advanced offer, you don't just get your old one back. The offer will lapse and you'll get a gate 1 offer. So, only request an advancement if you seriously believe you can deliver to the timescale that you're requesting. DNOs will continue to use technical limits, so that's curtailment, basically ahead of transmission works, to get people on quicker. However, the firm date, so when that technical limits restriction is lifted, will be used for the strategic alignment purposes. So you might have a technical limits offer that says you can get on 2027, but your firm date is 2034. You will then be put in the phase 2 pot for the strategic alignment process. So it's going to hand over to Matt, because I think since the last webinar, NESO have realised that there was a bit of a cliff edge on projects. So they've introduced some protections, which basically means that you are protected from being pushed out the back door of 2035, I like to say. So do you want to talk through this one, Matt?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that, Charlie. So as mentioned in some of the slides before, once gate 2 readiness has been met by all the projects that kind of fall within connections reform, as part of the strategic alignment criteria, NESO will then check to see if certain protections are eligible, which obviously, if applicable, can help de-risk your projects and sort of protect connection dates, point of connections, depending on which one you qualify for. Protection clause 1 is kind of the best protection available, the top of the range, if you will. It applies to existing agreements, so under CMP 435. It's one that usually only favors, or like it will only favor projects that have a connection date of 2026. It can be as late as the last day in the year, but it has to have a contracted date of on or before 31st of December 2026. And then you also have to prove that you've met milestone M2, which it's almost a prerequisite, if you will, or a given. So prove that you have planning permission, and then also provide evidence that you've met milestone M7, which is basically your project commitment. So that can come usually in the form of a FID letter, sort of board level, director level FID letter, where you confirm that you have planning, that, for example, you're engaging ICPs, and crucially, that you've sort of placed orders on long lead items, so sort of the elements on your program that can that have the sort of the longest lead. It's worth noting that for clause 1, if after the 20th of December 2024, so when the sort of initial proposal for reform went to Ofgem, if after that your project gets delayed as a result of the network company, then your original date can and will be retained. The next level up, or next level down, if you will, so not as good as clause 1, we have clause 2A, which again applies to existing agreements under CMP 435. For this one, and I appreciate that sort of first bullet point there has been and gone because we're now well and truly in 2025, but you would have needed to submit planning permission by the 20th of December of last year, and then have planning permission granted by the end of the Gate 2 evidence window, which will be later in the summer this year, or have one of the following. So any sort of off-taker contract signed, be it contracts for difference, so if you have a CFD lined up, or a capacity contract, or if you've received regulatory approval for your interconnector or offshore hybrid asset, probably not that relevant for a lot of projects. Also worth noting that for 2A, for example, the wording from NESO is that they will use best endeavors to provide a connection date that meets what you have in that off-taker contract. I guess in legal speak, that's probably one level below the sort of best wording you can have, but it's still implied that they will try and honor those dates that you have in those contracts. Next slide. So moving further down the list, you have a clause 2B. Now, both clause 2B and clause 3 apply for CMP 434 reapplicants. So if you reapply after the initial 435 window, these ones again for 2B, you need the one example of the same sort of off-taker contract, again, be it capacity market or anything else. You need to have that signed and sort of provide evidence for it. And then again, for clause 3, you need to submit for planning permission prior to the 435 CMP 435 window closing later this summer, and obviously obtain planning permission sometime after that closure. And then I think on the next slide, we have a bit of a summary. Yeah, thank you. On what each individual sort of protection clause gets you. So as mentioned, clause 1 is basically all green. So with that one, you have a guaranteed place in the queue. More importantly, and probably most relevant for people, your point of connection and date will be protected. And then you can also exceed the permitted zonal capacities, so the technology pots allocated under the CP30 plan, and also quite neatly it allows you to exceed the GB permitted capacity, although given that's only for projects with contracted connection dates of before 2026, that's probably unlikely that any of those will end up getting close to the GB permitted capacity. The next one down with only one difference. So even though you, for 2A, if you qualify for that, even if you do have a place guaranteed in the queue, as Charlie, I think, mentioned previously, your connection date and point of connection are technically not protected, so they can still change, even if you don't, for example, request for the POC to change, and also your connection date can potentially go back. And then again, as we move down through 2B and 3, and then technically a 3+, if you will. If your project gets refused, and then you go through the appeals process. Depending on where that falls, you have sort of less and less value attributed to those protections.
Thanks, Matt. So yes, I think it's quite important that you consider whether your projects could be eligible for some of these, because yeah, it guarantees you a connection. It might be that it moves back if it's clause 2A, for example, but you will still be in the queue. So yeah, just finally, all offers are going to be restudied in the queue. We're likely to see some sort of batching based on priority and connection date, but again, that's all sort of to be worked out amongst the networks. As mentioned before, hybrid projects can have technology in different gates. There's an ambition to provide all offers by the end of 2025. I stress the word ambition, so it might take longer. As I say, it's likely that DNOs may have to issue their offers a little later because they've got to get the offer from NISO first and then work that into variations in their contracts. And then naturally that means that there'll be impacts on any works that you've got to pay for and any securities. So I suppose what to do now. Check your contact details are up to date with the networks. Can't stress that enough. Ensure that your gate 2 ready. So you've got your land, you've got your red line boundary sorted, you've got you meet the minimum acreage, and you've got your self-declaration. Understand how you submit that to your network company. Consider whether you want to advance and what's deliverable, not just what you think might be good for a project sale, but what can you actually deliver? Because if you miss it, you don't have a project anymore. Consider, yeah, if you're eligible for any protections, to gather those evidence, and then maybe just look at doing a risk assessment against what the quotas are saying. Is it worth backing a particular project over another, given where the sort of technology pots are looking? If you do want to terminate, you can consider, dropping into gate 1 voluntarily and getting a gate 1 offer, which does remove any sort of securities and liabilities. At least that's the proposal at the moment, I believe. DNOs are also now looking at bringing gate 1 at distribution, because previously that was going to be ruled out, but that is now also being worked on by the ENA. And of course, we're here to help. We as Eclipse sit on a lot of these work groups, implementation hubs, so we're very plugged into the process. Matt, for his sins, has done a lot of analysis for customers over the last few months as to the impact on their pipeline. So yeah, if there's anything that we can do to help, don't hesitate to reach out. So I think I've probably talked for a lot longer than I'd hoped. So we do have time for some Q&A. I think we were supposed to wrap up around now, but I'm happy to stay on for a little bit longer. Apologies if other people do have to drop off.
Yeah, we'll try and get through as many as we can, and then if not, we'll get the guys to contact anyone whose questions weren't answered throughout.
Sure.
So the first one we've got is, I think this is with regards to slide 15 when the bingo card was up. Did you say that E&W have published a full list by GSP of protected projects, etc.? Where can we access that?
UK Power Networks have. So they've published an aggregated graph of their different technologies, their queues split up by protected, planning, no planning, all that sort of stuff versus the quota for the entire company area. Then at GSP level, they've got technology splits, and they have whether it's got whether they've met M2, M3, because the DNOs have a lot of this data anyway on land rights and planning. If the sample is so small as to be identifiable, they've just blanked it out. But I will send you, we can send around a link after this if you like. It's on their nodes, their network operation data dashboard, I think it stands for. Their data portal, basically.
Good, thanks. The next one is, have you seen any indication of how an older DNO grid offer, which is not subject to SOW reinforcements and does not contain a connection date, will meet the criteria of a contracted connection date for the purpose of Protection Clause 1?
Yes, Anthony, that's a very, very good question, and one that I've been asking repeatedly and still don't have a definitive answer for yet. I think it was, let's talk out of term, I think it was sort of news to NISO that DNOs didn't necessarily give you a contracted connection date. And if you're in part 2 of the Appendix G, so not dependent on transmission works, again, you don't really have a transmission access date in your contract. Now, apparently the DNOs do provide dates to NISO. I did ask this of the ENA and UKPN very recently. The feedback I got was we're still working on this because we want to make sure there's something that's robust. So what my advice would be at the moment would be get the DNO to agree in writing, either via a variation or agreement of a construction plan, so milestone M6, that they can meet a 2026 date. That would be my advice at the moment. In reality, once the protection is gained, the protection is not then taken away. So if it then does slip for unavoidable purposes, reasons afterwards, then that's fine. But yeah, I think watch this space on that. But at the moment, I would just try and get them to agree to a program that meets M6 that has a connection date of 2026.
Thank you. The next one is, if I have a project with planning, land rights, and connection date before the end of 2026, do I need to apply for protection, or should I just submit the Gate 2 evidence?
You will need the DNO. If it's small, the DNO will apply for protection on your behalf. If it's large, I think I'll have to double check that. I think they should be able to look at it on the Gate 2 evidence. But I would speak to your DNO contact or your NISO account manager.
Thank you. Are Eclipse aware of any outstanding DNO project progression variations post-NISO two-stage offer processes? UKPN say that they still have over 100 project progression variations that have not been issued yet. This could have significant impact on UKPN embedded connection where they don't have any protections.
Yeah, it's a good point. So there's obviously still a lot of unsigned contracts floating around out there. I think the ambition is that everyone should be in a signed position by the time the window opens, or at least by the time it closes. This was raised on a DNO forum recently, and they said they were working through all of their unsigned contracts with NISO to get everyone into a signed position. So if you are in a situation where you need one, I would continue badgering them because, yeah, frankly, everyone the queue needs to be locked down before this whole process begins. We shouldn't be having people sitting around with unsigned offers.
Thank you. And for a lot of our sites, especially small-scale projects, we have secured planning via the TCPA process from local authorities rather than the DCO process. Would that be acceptable? As only references I've seen are for the DCO. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So that would meet your planning milestone. The only reason why DCO would be relevant is if you're using the DCO to get your land rights. Whereas if you go through TCPA, you'll have to get your option to lease for your land rights, and then your planning consent is fine. It's just if you are planning to use the CPO powers in the DCO for the land rights that's relevant.
Cool. Will a technical limit offer be kept if they're in 2027?
Yes. So you will go through the process. Your firm date, so whatever the date that limit is lifted, will be used for the purposes of the queue reorganization. If that date is after 2035, then ask to advance it, because that's actually a very good point. I should have mentioned that. Anything that's currently at 2037, if you don't request to advance, you will be kicked out the back door instantly unless you're protected, because they're not looking at stuff after 2035. Well, unless the network build takes longer than 2035, but the pot is pre-2035. So yes, the technical limits offer will still be kept. If anything, you might see your curtailment improve because things will fall out. And then if the background network changes to such a way that you no longer need the technical limits, then I imagine the constraint would be lifted.
Thank you. Can you clarify the timing of the next submission window in January or December, please?
Not presently, but I believe it'll be around November time. That's the last I saw.
And then NISO published updates to the 3 connection reform methodologies on the 21st of March. Are there any significant changes to the wording that developers should be aware of?
Yeah, it's a good question, actually. So when we were preparing this webinar, we came across that. So we've incorporated some of that into this. I think one of them was about the clause 1 protection still being afforded if the DNO or the TO delays you after the 20th of December. There is a change log on the website, so I'd advise them to look through that. A lot of it's quite clerical, to be honest. But yeah, nothing drastically has changed.
Thank you. And then, are the Clean Power 35 tech zone limits about to be amended?
I haven't seen anything about that. Some parties are lobbying that they should be lifted or amended. It's all still with Ofgem at the moment. The government has provided their advice as targets, and NISO has interpreted them as caps. I guess my personal view is this rush towards data centers means that they probably are going to need to be reviewed quite quickly. But at the moment, I've not seen anything confirming yes or no on that.
Thank you. And then just one last one. Apologies if they missed it at the start of the webinar, but are Ofgem still on course for approval mid-April?
Yes, that's what we're still hearing at the moment.
I think that's the end of our questions, as far as I can see. So we'll be distributing the slides and the recording after the webinar, so all this information will be available to everyone. And thank you to the team presenting. Hope everyone found it very useful.
Thank you. I've just put the link to the UKPN dashboard in the chat as well. Thanks,
Okay.
everybody. Thanks for joining.
There's what I was going to say. There's a hand up. There was a hand up.
That's all right. I can go back and find it, and I can get you guys to contact them.
Cool.
Thanks everyone.
Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.